Hello class, it's Professor Streeter, and in this video I'm going to return to the week 6 slideshow on the myth of Prometheus and the origin of the gods in Hesiod's Theogony, which I discussed at the end of the class period, so you can go back and look at the class recording and remind yourself of what I was talking about in the first part of the slideshow. But I'm going to shift now to the second part of the slideshow in the myth of Prometheus and try to connect that to some passages from Miller's novel Circe. Notice that Circe meets Prometheus in chapter 2, and that's a defining moment in her life, in the education of Circe. We can think of the novel as structured narratively as a kind of the education of Circe, right? We see the stages of her development over the course of many generations, right? That's the thing about the gods. They've been around a long time, so they develop slowly. But one of the questions, and then I want to then shift to some passages in Homer and tie a reading of Homer's Odyssey to the myth of Prometheus. Okay, the myth of Prometheus is a much older story than Homer's Odyssey. All of the Greek audience that would have been listening to the tales of the Greek heroes as they returned from the war in Troy knew the older stories of the gods and how Prometheus came to suffer the way he does in chapter 2 of we see it graphically in chapter 2 of Miller's novel. But this is the question I want to focus on, suffering. Notice Homer's Odyssey begins with a question about why mortals, why human beings suffer, and who is to blame for the suffering of human beings. And this is a central question that we'll talk about for the rest of the semester. Why do people suffer? Why do human beings suffer? What is the meaning of our suffering? And how do we understand the meaning of pain and the meaning of suffering in relation to larger questions about the meaning and purpose and of a human life, right, and of human existence? Right? The big questions, right? What are we doing here, right? Well, if you go back and read some of the ancient texts of the Buddha, right, and if you're interested in Eastern philosophy, Eastern religion, and Buddhist ideas, you'll notice that, right, for the Buddha, that one of the first truths, the first noble truths of the Buddha is that life is suffering. Life is a form of suffering. And the sooner we acknowledge that and face that, right, the better our lives will go, right? And the Buddha has an idea, a practice that is meant to not release us from suffering exactly, but come to live free from it, right? By detaching ourselves from the cause of our suffering, which doesn't mean the suffering disappears, right? But it no longer governs our being. It no longer drives our every move. Okay, so that's Buddha. Homer is certainly not a Buddhist, right? But Homer, in telling us the story of Odysseus and his suffering, is showing us something about the relationship between human existence and the experience of suffering, and what it means to live a life of suffering, and how to find meaning through the experience of pain and suffering. The gods, interestingly, they don't suffer the way we do, although they are capable of it. And we see in Prometheus an example of the gods suffering, the gods experiencing pain. But this is definitive of human existence, right? We are here a short time. We lose much of what we love over the course of a lifetime. We lose through death or through other catastrophes, short of death, disease, financial ruin. Things happen to us in life that cause suffering. And moreover, we are always sort of aware of ourselves as not being entirely comfortable or happy with the situation that we're in, right? It's very hard for us to be in the present without having anxiety about the past, right? Worrying about what we did wrong in the past, or holding grudges or regrets. It's very hard to be in the present without having anxiety about the future, right, and what the future holds. And so we are constantly sort of battling with anxiety that is directed at the past and directed at the future. Makes it very hard for us to be in the present. We're always striving, a kind of restless striving that we saw in Gilgamesh. Notice. We saw that in Gilgamesh. We see it in Odysseus as well. His striving to get home, his struggle to get home. Right, wants to stay in this world and keep acting, keep doing, keep accomplishing something. But right, that brings with it the experience of pain and suffering. Of course, death would mark the end of a certain kind of suffering, a certain kind of pain, right? I mean, you could think of death as the end of pain and suffering, but this is not what we want. We don't want death, right? In some sense, we're seeking a life without pain and suffering, but how do we achieve that, right? We can't become gods, and we don't want to die. So, but these are some questions, some big questions that we're sitting with. All right, I'm going to pause here, and the next video will actually look at the slideshow. But this is sort of the opening act, the prelude to thinking about the myth of Prometheus and his experience of suffering, why he suffers, and the meaning of his suffering, and then move to look at some passages in Miller and Homer. Okay.